Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today's webinar topic is When Renewable Portfolio Standards Max Out. And it's being brought to you today by the Clean Energy States Alliance and our RPS Collaborative. So to get started, I'd like to just quickly go over a housekeeping slide. You can see here that you can join the audio portion of the webinar by using your computer's speakers or a mic and headset, or you can listen to this by telephone. All of our participants are on listen-only mode, so we will not be able to hear you, but we would love to get your questions. So please submit questions on the question box that you'll see on your webinar console panel. Type in your question and hit send. Your questions will be queued up and answered following today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded and it will be archived along with all of our previous webinar recordings on CESA's website, and you can go to that page anytime to look at other recordings as well as this one at www.cesa.org/webinars. So again, you're in listen-only mode, but please submit questions as they occur to you during the presentation, and we'll get to your questions following today's presenter. With that, I'd like to introduce you to Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. So Warren, please take it away.
Hey, thanks very much, Maria. Let me first tell everybody a little bit about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national organization composed of state energy organizations and other public agencies that are all interested in advancing clean energy. We have members in 17 states plus the District of Columbia, and we engage in a wide range of activities, including, as you'll see on the next slide, we coordinate the RPS Collaborative. The RPS Collaborative is an effort that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and it helps state RPS program administrators, federal agency representatives, and other stakeholders share information about what's going on in the wonderful world of RPS and helps them grapple with challenges and issues related to RPSs. We have webinars like this one, we produce reports, and we have a monthly newsletter that provides news focused on RPS events and activities around the country. All of that's for free, and you can sign up by going to our website, and you could see the website address at the bottom of the page. So let's switch to the topic of today's webinar. We have a new report out, When Renewable Portfolio Standards Max Out, and the author of that report, Ed Holt, is going to give us a sense of what some of his key findings and conclusions are. Many states are reaching the point where they're getting near their maximum RPS target, and the question is, what does that mean and what can they do about it? And there's no better person to talk about this than Ed Holt. Ed is president of Ed Holt and Associates. He's produced quite a few reports for us at the RPS Collaborative over the years. And the reason why we have repeatedly called on him is he has unparalleled knowledge of the intricacies of RPS program design and of the rules and requirements of RPSs around the country. So Ed is going to give you a sense of what's in his new report. So take it away.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to do the webinar. Welcome to everyone who is on the call or on the webinar. Today, as both Warren and Maria have said, I'm going to talk about what happens when RPSs reach their maximum targets and look at what options states might consider and what the implications of those options might be. We often see in the headlines, particularly in the trade press, about states that have increased and extended their RPS targets so that their maximums are now 10 to 20 years away. But this map shows that 4 states, the states in red, have already crossed the finish line, those being Iowa and Texas and Wisconsin and Montana. And another 15 states, shown in 2 shades of brown, they'll reach their maximum targets by 2025, which kind of sounds like a long ways away, but you know, it's only about 7 or 8 years. So we thought it would be interesting to see what states say about their RPS end-of-life plans. And as you might expect, state plans vary, and they fall into essentially 3 categories. Many states call for their RPS to continue after reaching its maximum, that is shown in yellow. In those cases, the RPS statutes often specify some language like 20% by 2025 and thereafter is the phrase that's most frequently used. And so in those states, the RPS is maintained at a flat level, and the utilities or other obligated entities presumably will continue to have to report each year. A second plan or option is that some states are just simply silent about what happens after the peak requirement is reached. Yes, I'm saying that saying nothing is a plan. It's a default plan. Without explicit policy, the RPS would simply end. And these states are shown in light brown on the map, and here the obligated electricity suppliers, which I'm just going to call them utilities from here on out to make it simpler, they won't have to procure any renewable energy or report annually on renewable energy in their portfolios, at least not under any RPS statute or requirement. The third option, or the third plan that I found, and there's only one example that I could find, puts the RPS on an automatic increase. Massachusetts, here shown in light green, directs that the Class 1 requirement for new resources must reach 15% by 2020, and then that's when it goes on autopilot. It increases by an additional 1% each year thereafter. Now, it's not clear exactly what would happen when it reaches 100%, but that won't be reached until 2105 unless there are some other legislative changes. So there's plenty of time for the legislature to work its will with the RPS before then. So how might these plans sort of play out? Utilities in states where the RPS ends abruptly would no longer need to buy renewable energy. Their market may disappear, so generators in those states would have to find other markets for their renewable energy certificates, or RECs. And REC prices for the state with no further compliance need would presumably collapse. If the RPS continues flat after reaching its maximum target, renewable generators that previously were used to satisfy a growing RPS probably, or may at least, continue selling to the same utilities, or they might begin looking to other states where demand is growing and REC prices are higher. The generator's home state may no longer count on that generation to meet even its flatline compliance needs. And when a state's RPS is still increasing, it's expected to motivate new generation development in the state and in neighboring states within the regional grid. We need to remember that generally, states allow out-of-state generation to count towards RPS compliance if the generator is located in adjacent states, or in some cases if it's in the same regional electricity grid, or the electricity is delivered to the RPS state or region. But the takeaway here is that RPS policies of neighboring states can affect what happens to renewable energy generated in your state. And likewise, a state's own RPS policies can affect neighboring states. So states considering changes to their RPS should consider the impacts in nearby states, and that means really keeping an eye on what's going on with your neighbors and communicating with them about your own plans as well as theirs. So let's look at a few examples. Iowa already met its RPS target in 2007, and its RPS is effectively ended. But that has not slowed development in Iowa, because the state has an abundant and very cost-competitive wind resource. So the effect of no RPS in Iowa may be felt more in neighboring states, where Iowa wind can be used under certain circumstances to help utilities in Minnesota and Missouri and Illinois and Wisconsin to comply with their RPS requirements. There's also a growing voluntary market demand that affects renewable energy availability and REC prices for compliance markets. So a lot of Iowa wind capacity has been contracted by large corporate buyers for voluntary market claims. Another example is New York. Under New York's original RPS, the state, specifically NYSERDA, state agency, entered into 10-year contracts for RECs. Those contracts are now beginning to expire, and because the generators were built prior to 2015, they're not eligible for the new Tier 1 requirement under the Clean Energy Standard that replaced the RPS. And there's approximately 1,500 megawatts of renewable energy capacity that began operation between 2006 and 2015 that will be released from contracts over the period 2016 to 2025. Now, this shouldn't affect the need for new renewables development in New York because of the new requirements that were announced in 2016, but it could affect New York's neighbors. As the New York RPS contracts expire, these New York generators will look to sell their RECs in the most lucrative RPS market, and that's likely to be in one of the New England states. The entry of New York RECs into New England in greater quantities than previously available will probably make compliance in those states cheaper, because the added supply of RECs will have a depressing effect on price. Alternatively, the New York generators could sell to utilities in the PJM region. Some of these states require that an eligible generator must be located in PJM region, but other states in the region, in the PJM region, simply require energy delivery into PJM. And then in the Pacific Northwest, the Washington RPS, it will reach its maximum in 2020, and although compliance will continue at the same level beyond that date, the still growing RPS demand in Oregon and California might provide a more lucrative market opportunity than in Washington. So this could create scarcity in Washington, drive up REC prices, while undercutting hoped for investment and economic development benefits in Oregon and California. And a final example is Texas, which has met its mandated target and even its higher voluntary goal considerably earlier than its RPS requires. So Texas has a lot of RECs that are excess to their compliance needs. This has little effect on neighboring state RPS markets, though, because most of Texas is poorly interconnected with neighboring states. But a lot of Texas RECs are being sold to voluntary buyers, both in-state and out-of-state. And specifically in 2015, I saw that Texas REC retirements for voluntary markets, both in-state and out-of-state, exceeded RECs used for in-state RPS compliance by 18 million RECs to 15 million RECs. So the voluntary market can't be ignored in some of these cases. The simple point is, with all these examples, that most REC markets in nearby states are interdependent, and the end of RPSs in some states will free up RECs that are no longer needed for compliance, and those RECs could migrate to other state markets. So in a minute, I'm going to talk further about implications of the RPS end-of-life plans, but first I want to say that a lot of my information about the benefits and costs of state RPS policies comes from years of analytical work by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. One of their most recent joint works is cited here, and I highly recommend it. I'm not going to describe it in any detail. It's not my work, and I don't really have the time to go into that kind of depth on this particular sophisticated analysis, except to say that the most recent study analyzes costs, benefits, and impacts of RPSs, and the team analyzed and compared 3 scenarios. One is a no RPS sort of baseline that assumes no further growth in RPS requirements beyond 2014, but it does include limited economic growth in renewables. The second one is an existing RPS scenario, which assumes that RPS requirements continue to grow based on existing state policies as of July 2016. And lastly, a high renewable electricity scenario, which assumes that nearly all states adopt an RPS with relatively aggressive targets. And I'll just mention as we go along how I think that this relates to the work that I'm presenting here. So these are the options that I see for states maxing out on their RPS targets. The job done option means that a state considers that its RPS has had the desired effect when it reaches its maximum target, and compliance and reporting is discontinued. And this is very, I think, is similar to the National Lab's no RPS baseline scenario. States whose RPS ends abruptly could simply extend the compliance requirement without increasing the targets. This would continue demand without upsetting the regional supply-demand dynamic, and is somewhat like the National Lab's existing RPS scenario. Or a state could leave targets unchanged, but they could expand coverage to include utilities not previously obligated to meet the RPS. Assuming that this expanded coverage would affect smaller utilities that were previously exempted, this would increase overall demand by a relatively small amount, unless the state, of course, has lots of small utilities that are exempted, like a lot of cooperatives, for example. And then lastly, if states are reaching their maximum targets, they could set new higher targets to continue support for new renewable development. This is like the National Lab's high renewables scenario. And in the past year or two, as you can see, there are a number of states listed here that have done just that. So now I'm going to turn to look at each of these options in turn and sort of summarize what some of the implications are. With a job done, they would the states that have no further RPS would have no further cost of compliance or administration, which is probably one of their objectives. Their compliance costs would no longer contribute to electricity prices, but because new renewables won't further displace natural gas, the downward pressure on gas prices will dissipate. So one might offset the other. That might be kind of a wash. The investment in new renewables development will probably shift to other states that are more actively promoting RPSs and renewables. The RECs might be sold out of state, and that will reduce claims for in-state renewable energy use. And they'll have lost opportunities for emission reductions and water use reductions and foregone renewable energy job opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, each option has spillover effects in neighboring states. RECs that are no longer needed in-state will seek stronger RPS markets, leading to more competition, lower REC prices in neighboring states because of increased supply. And RPS termination in one state may lower the need for renewable investment not only in-state but also in neighboring states. For the option that I referred to, extending or expanding the RPS without actually increasing the targets, in these states it may provide enough support to eligible facilities so that they don't shut down prematurely. It may be enough to maintain interest in renewable energy investment in state, though neighboring state generation may substitute for that in-state investment. There's no guarantee that it will continue. Environmental and economic benefits can be maintained. They don't lose renewable energy to neighboring states, and they'll still have a compliance and administration cost, though it may be minimal if the target is maintained but not expanded. And the extending or expanding the RPS coverage also has implications for neighboring states. Maintaining a flat RPS target shouldn't disturb RPS, or rather REC market dynamics. And expanding coverage, if you add some utilities or some load that was not previously covered in the RPS, will create slightly more demand for RECs in the region. And then neighboring states could lose RECs to the expanding state, and this could increase REC prices in neighboring states. So those are things that you might want to think about. For those states that are reaching their maximums, they could set higher targets to continue support for new renewable development. And in the past year or two, there are a bunch of states in the District of Columbia that have done just that. In these states, the motivation for renewable energy investment and economic development in state should continue. And the overall shift to cleaner generation will continue, and it's likely that jobs and tax revenue will continue to grow, as will environmental benefits. And there will be a continuing and probably increased cost of compliance, which can lead to continued upward pressure on electricity prices, but this may be partly offset by lower natural gas prices from renewables that displace natural gas generation. And an increase in RPS targets in one state will also have the spillover effects in neighboring states again. Here it's a little squishy in what I have to say, because depending on the relative cost of compliance in each state, increasing RPS targets in one state may draw RECs away from the neighboring states, or it may also motivate enough additional REC supply that does not happen. Also, increasing RPS targets in one state may lower or may increase REC prices for neighboring states. It's a little hard to generalize on the net allocation of benefits among states, because it really depends on overall supply and demand. So to summarize, we found 4 states that have reached already their peak RPS targets. Another 15 will max out by 2025. And on the other hand, there are a number of states that have increased their RPS targets as they approach their peak. We've also talked about state plans for RPS end of life. In 10 states, the RPS ends when the peak is reached, and in 17 states, once the RPS maxes out, it continues in force without increasing, and in one state, it continues to increase automatically by 1% each year. Of course, legislatures in these states may always revisit and revise the RPS statutes, which they are known to do sometimes all too frequently. Faced with nearing their maximum RPS target, states have several options, as suggested by current experience. They can let the RPS expire, they can maintain their RPS at a fixed level, or they can increase their RPS targets further. All of these options have impacts in state, and almost all options have interactive effects on RPS compliance in neighboring states. This suggests that neighboring states in particular should be paying attention to what's going on around them, certainly those states with which they trade electricity. States considering changes to their RPS should discuss these changes with their neighboring states so that the neighbors aren't surprised by the sudden availability of more renewable energy when an RPS ends, or by the increasing demand for renewable energy within the region when an RPS is increased. Either effect could have implications for the price of RECs and for the cost of RPS compliance. And with that, I'm going to close and turn it back to Warren and Maria, and we'll take some questions.
Hey Ed, thanks very much. And we do indeed have some questions. One has to do with your comments about Iowa and Texas and the implication of those states that decide it's just job done. And what this person asks is, why doesn't the actual experience in Iowa and Texas with the continued development of wind and solar in those states dispel the conclusion that there could be a loss of jobs, loss of emission reduction impacts, and other things like that if a state just decides that it's job done and they don't continue the RPS?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my assessment is that in those two cases in particular, and there may be other states, but in particular, Texas and Iowa have such a strong and cost-competitive renewable resource, particularly in wind, that they have developed and taken advantage of, that it's been the economics that have continued to drive development in those states. I'm not sure that how easily that could be replicated in very many other states. I mean, certainly every state has its own different kind of resource that is, that's local, indigenous, and hopefully cost competitive, but it may not be as strong a resource base as these two states have. So that's why I say that it's that they are not necessarily, you can't point to them as being saying this is what's going to happen in our states unless you really feel that you've got a real resource advantage in terms of cost.
Okay. And someone asked a clarifying question about this, something you somewhat covered, but it would be good to reemphasize. And what this person asked, with Iowa no longer having an RPS, does REC revenue from other states continue to flow to Iowa wind turbine farms?
Sure. I mean, the energy gets, whether the energy is sold along with the RECs or whether they're sold separately, there is a value to the RECs, and that goes to, or some of it at least goes back to the generators. There may be, there may be middlemen involved, or there may be markups along the way, but certainly there is benefit, financial benefit that goes back to the generators in Iowa, even though they have no compliance obligation in Iowa.
Okay. And could you explain how maxing out an RPS and deciding not to continue it diminishes environmental benefits? What this person points out is the renewable capacity is still in the ground and it's still dispatched at essentially zero marginal cost. So it will be dispatched ahead of other capacity. The capacity isn't going away even if the RPS target cease.
Yeah. Well, for states whose RPS just simply ends, discontinued, the benefits of the resources that they have will continue to contribute, but remember the claims to those environmental benefits go along with the RECs. That is, the REC represents the zero emissions. The zero emissions will physically, occur in the region, in the area of the generator. Although, with greenhouse gas emissions, those are really global benefits. But the right to make claims on it goes with the REC. So that's one reason why there could be, from that perspective, a diminishment of environmental benefits. The other thing that I think I was trying to say is that the environmental benefits don't continue to grow. That is, the ones that are created by the existing renewable generators that continue to operate, that will continue. And I think that's really what you are getting at, or what the questioner was getting at. But the motivation to continue to develop new generation and create additional environmental benefits will be diminished, if not disappear.
Okie doke. And what are the likely future impacts on RPS programs from the increase in the power portfolio of renewables that are highly variable and fluctuating, such as wind and solar, which thus could pose reliability and handling burden and cost on the power grid?
Yeah, that's an issue that's been getting a great deal of attention in our community recently, in the energy policy arena more broadly also. It's not really, I think it's less of an RPS issue, at least currently. The reliability questions so far, I have not seen them be addressed directly by RPS requirements. There has been some talk about potentially trying to motivate through some kind of a mandate or requirement more generation that occurs on, say, system peaks, so it has more value. But to my knowledge, that hasn't really been implemented, other than I believe Nevada offers a credit multiplier for generation that occurs on a peak. But in terms of, that's not totally system reliability. It's related to the system reliability, but variable resources and integrating with the mix, the overall supply mix, is just not, it's something that is addressed more by system operators, the control area operators, and not so much, to my knowledge, through RPSs.
Okay, this question asks you to speculate on a couple of possible scenarios for the future, and it has to do with PV, and has a couple components to this question. And the person asked, if PV has a 25-year life, does it make sense to phase in an SREC program over 25 years so PV replacements continue and level employment is maintained after the first 25 years? And then, without a continuing RPS, would there be less incentive to replace the PV that reaches the end of its life?
Not sure that I've taken the question on board. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm not saying that I didn't understand, that it's not stated clearly, but I didn't quite get it. So could you run it by, or maybe rephrase it if you have an insight to it, Warren?
Yeah, this person is looking to think about a long-term strategy for maintaining PV growth and PV employment, and is saying, look, if you envision that PV has a life of 25 years, does it make sense to structure your RPS to require continuing PV generation after those 25 years through some sort of SREC program? And if you don't have that sort of SREC program in place, is it likely that after the 25 years, PV won't be replaced?
I'm still struggling a little bit, but I think that the RPS, even an RPS that continues flat, PV that's installed, if it has a 25-year life, it will continue to have value in satisfying even a flat RPS. and it will, and compliance will be determined or demonstrated, I should say, by retirement of those solar RECs. If the state, I mean, I don't think that there would be, there might be somewhat of a difference if the state has, you know, a solar carve out, a set aside, so there's a true SREC program where the PV RECs are valued differently, and that might, there might be some a different driver there, but I don't see that doing something. I'm not seeing a fourth option for trying to continue to stimulate PV development with, say, an SREC program that's somehow different from just a regular RPS program with a, you know, with a solar carve out. I don't think I'm picking this up totally, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Okay, doke. And not to get you involved here in disputes between states, I'd like you to comment on something one person wrote in, saying the Iowa Economic Development Authority has been running ads bragging about supplying 35% of their electricity with wind, but their neighbors are buying the RECs. Shouldn't their neighbors be getting credit for the wind?
The answer is yes. Their neighbors should be getting the credit for the wind because they control the RECs. I mean, the difference in when in order to make a claim, the person making the claim needs to own and retire the RECs. Now, behind that statement is a question about, well, what then constitutes a claim? If there is a, let's say, an agency that is, to use the word in the question, that is bragging about how much renewable energy it's motivating or creating, then I would, you know, that sounds like it's making a claim. Without looking at the actual language, I can't say for sure, but it sounds like they're making a claim, so there may be a double claim there. On the other hand, a state that is making, you know, is providing incentives to a variety of renewable generators, I think can fairly make a factual statement that, you know, we have provided incentives, or we've supported the development of X megawatts, or you know, certain. I think if you leave it to you know, so many megawatts of capacity or so many megawatt hours that we've paid for in some fashion, that's, and if it's more of a statistical statement or report rather than a customer-facing sort of press release or customer-facing claim, then I think that's legitimate. I mean, there is the line between a report to the Energy Information Administration, for example, or a statistical statement about what has occurred is one thing, but it's another thing to say, you know, we have done this and it has these certain benefits which are in fact conveyed with the ownership of the REC.
Yes, good point. I mean, I think in the case of this Iowa case, we'd have to look at the ad.
Yes.
Because if what the ad is saying is something like 35% of the electricity generated in Iowa comes from wind, that's a demonstrable fact, and they're not saying anything about where that generation is going. That
right.
would be very different than them saying all residents in Iowa are getting 35% of their electricity from wind.
Right.
Does
There's kind of a
that seem right?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful. I'm not sure that this works in all cases, but it might be helpful to make the distinction between a generation statement and a consumption statement. If you're saying you're getting or you're buying or Iowa consumers are getting, that's different than just saying Iowa generated so much, or you know, we supported the development of this much renewable energy.
Yep. Good. Well, we'll take one more question, and then you can see if there's anything else you want to say by way of closing. And I'll say to those folks who I didn't get to your questions, I'd encourage you, if you want to pursue them, write to Ed. I didn't ask them because they were either a little too technical or slightly off the subject of the webinar. But as for the last webinar question, it seems like there are quite a few states that are in a position they should be thinking about what to do next. Are you aware of the extent to which there are discussions going on in states that are coming close to reaching their end target?
Yes, I am aware. When I say aware of discussions, what I mean is I have seen reports that there are a number of states that are considering legislation to change their RPS, either to extend it or mostly to increase it. Whether they will come to fruition, you know, this year in this legislative session is certainly an open question. We saw that an increase that was proposed in Nevada passed the legislature just a few weeks ago, but was not signed by the governor, or was vetoed by the governor. So it didn't take hold there. But so there are states that are certainly thinking about it, and in the report there's a list of those that I was aware of that that have sort of open consideration that's taking place in legislative venues right now. So you can take a look for that if it's of interest.
Great. And anything you want to leave with people? Well,
I think I've made my points as well as I'd like, but you know, I will say, just from a perspective of initiating this research, I started off thinking mainly about the state and what goes on in the state, but and that was my focus. But very quickly I realized that probably, or perhaps the more maybe not more significant, but less expected areas to look is in the effects on nearby states, and those other states will be affected by these other changes. That was not front and center on my radar screen until I got into this research. So that's probably the big thing that I took away from this.
Hey, Ed, thanks very much. I think your report presents a good overview of important topic, and a topic that will become increasingly important as more states start reaching their maximum target. And to all of you who listened on the call today, thanks for joining us. We will let you know about future RPS webinars. We will certainly be having some, although we do not have any scheduled at this exact moment. So thanks very much for joining us. Bye now.